your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Tuesday edition of Point of View. In the second hour, we're going to get into some of the things that have transpired. Of course, we have what's called a 12-day war. We've talked about a possible ceasefire, sort of on again, off again. We'll get into some of the details there, as well as all sorts of other issues in the news that we certainly will be discussing in the second hour. But our first hour, we want to spend some time talking with our good friend, Dr. Kerby Leman. First of all, of course, we have interviewed him on a variety of different books, but I love the series. Be a Great Leader was the last time we talked to him. This time, Be a Great Teacher. He is, of course, an internationally known psychologist, radio and TV personality, a humorist, probably best known for like the Birth Order book and Have a New Kid by Friday and Making Kids and Children Mind Without Losing Yours, a graduate of University of Arizona and a good friend. So, Kerby Leman, how you doing?
Hey, I'm so glad to be with you again, Kerby. I was thinking about how many times you and I have talked.
It's been decades.
Yeah, I don't know about you. I'm getting old as dirt. But you know what? I want to tell you something. Every time that we release a book, one of my questions to my publicist, who I love, by the way, I say, listen, have we got Point of View with Kerby Anderson book? And, sometimes I have to wait. I get impatient. So I had to wait over a month to get this interview with you. So I'm just glad to be with you. I enjoy you. You're relevant, and you scratch where us itch, and you're practical and relevant. And I just want you to know I appreciate your ministry, man.
Again, if you're not familiar with the books, we've talked about this before. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and this has been a theme of some of his latest books. By the way, his daughter will be joining us later because she works as well in this particular area. I think you will benefit from some of the work that, of course, happens at the Leman Academy of Excellence. But one of the things I got to say, Kevin, is I've heard your story over the years about how you weren't really doing very well in college, to put it mildly, but this first introduction sort of filled in the gaps. I had no idea some of the experiences that you had before you finally decided to go to the University of Arizona after getting kicked out of another school. And again, you just talked about how boring school was, which is why you've really decided to have the Leman Academy for Excellence focus on something that understands young people and understands what we need to do to teach teachers how to be better teachers.
Well, let me start with that because it sounds like I made it up, but it's the God's honest truth. In April of my senior year, a teacher, she was old as dirt. She was somewhere between estrogen and death, believe me. And she was a math teacher. Her name was Eleanor Wilson. Never married, Miss Wilson, never had kids, a great teacher. But she pulled me aside in April of my senior year. She said, Kevin, and she said it with emphasis, Kevin, have you ever thought that maybe you could use those skills you have for something positive in life? And again, with God as my judge, that was the first time a teacher ever said to me that I had skills. I was in a reading group with kids who ate paste. I was written off by many. I did graduate, but only with her help. And from April of my senior year till June, in New York State, they keep you in school until June, which is an original sin in my book. I graduated, but I graduated fourth and bottom of my class. But that dear woman tutored me in her home 4 days a week in my senior year, or I wouldn't even graduated. So I was woefully prepared for college. I applied to colleges you never heard of. Our own church denominational school, located in Chicago, Illinois, turned me down. I even sent them scripture, Kerby, about forgiveness. And that didn't work. So, long story short, I'll try to make this as brief as I can. 9 days before the semester started, they relented and they let me in on probation, with a letter to both me and my mom and dad that said, we really don't think this is a great idea, but we're willing to give it a shot. Kevin has to pull average C's or better, or he's gone. So I was admitted on probation. Now, the saga continues because they throw me out of school a year and a semester later for stealing a conscience fund, which I insist was just a prank, a good prank. I still think it was funny. But a dean of students threw me out.
Yeah.
Let me fast forward 10 years from that point. 10 years later, I was the dean of students at the University of Arizona.
Yes.
So something happened along the way. Well, I met Jesus, and I met Jesus by way of my wife, who I was a janitor in a hospital making $195 a month. And we met. I fell in love with her. She was a believer. Long story short, God did a work in my life, a 180, and I became a new person. I went on, became a dean's list student. I was on a lot of dean's lists, but never a good one until then. So God has a great sense of humor, So that's why one of the reasons why I love teachers. I absolutely love teachers. They are a difference maker, and Eleanor Wilson was certainly a difference maker in my life.
I love the fact that when you were the assistant dean of students, you didn't put up with student manipulation because you knew all the tricks, because you had actually engaged in a good number of them over the years, which I thought was a great line as well.
You're reading my mind. I'm sitting there thinking, kid, if you only knew who you were talking to, you'd never go there. And by the way, the school that threw me out years later brought me back and gave me an honorary doctorate degree. So go figure.
Yeah. North Park University, in case anybody wanted to know. I've heard bits and pieces of your story, but this was, I think, a great introduction because it really helped me kind of put all the pieces together. And again, it's amazing to me that your wife was willing to marry a janitor at the time, but look at where you are now. And in some respects, that illustrates why you've had such a heart for what we call the Leman Academy of Excellence. And for just a minute, mention that because it is, in some respects, so kind of goes hand in glove with everything that's in this book.
Yeah, well, number one, we're a public charter school. We have tons of teachers who are followers of Christ. We don't let anybody walk over a teacher or another student. We have high expectations for kids. We're not afraid to pull the rug out and let that little buzzard tumble if that has to be. We hit them with what we call reality discipline. What I love is I've been a teacher all my life. I taught at the University of Arizona for 10 years. But now I get to teach without correcting papers and stuff when I teach our teachers. And one of the things I teach our teachers is, hey, listen, your yes has to be yes, your no has to be no.
Right.
You have to be an authority, not an authoritarian. Now, you and I grew up probably in authoritarian homes. I did, for sure. And my dad would say something like, hey, 8 o'clock, and he'd point. He should have been a German short hair. He was a great pointer. And he'd say, 8 o'clock, that meant go to bed. If you didn't move, he would say, hey, you want to go to bed under your own power? Or you want to be ricocheted to bed? But you're going to bed. I mean, he was the authoritarian. And keep in mind, for all you believers out there, ask yourself the question, is God an authoritarian? No. But he is the supreme what? Authority. Every knee shall bow. We know that. So the teacher that I want to produce is a teacher who never opens her mouth in that classroom until everything is what? Quiet. She's not permissive. She's not trying to be somebody's best friend. She's got that wonderful midpoint view.
Going to take a break, and when we come back in just a minute, we'll talk about some of the different kinds of structures and attitudes of teachers, all part of this new book, Be a Great Teacher by Friday. We'll be
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Years ago, a doctor wrote an article entitled, What's Keeping David McCullough from Sleeping? This noted historian and award-winning author had trouble sleeping because he was worrying about what was happening in the country. He was concerned that our leaders have forgotten about history, they're unaware of the past, and uninterested in how they would be remembered in the future. Timothy Gegline, who was a special assistant to President Bush, opened his article with a story to remind us how ignorant students and adults are about history. One study from years ago by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute surveyed more than 2,500 Americans. They found that only half of those adults could name the 3 branches of government, and only 36% of college graduates could do so. 18% of students tested could not name a single right or freedom guaranteed under the First Amendment. Turns out that the highest performing school on this civics test was Harvard University, but even this prestigious school did not do that well. Harvard scored 69%. You know, most teachers would consider that to be a D+. In other words, it would be a failing grade. A more recent study by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni found that half of all college graduates did not know how long the terms of their representatives and senators were, and 43% did not know the First Amendment gave them freedom of speech. A full third could not identify any rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. So I would suggest that you remember that all those students surveyed are now of voting age, and some may be running for public office. Yes, that can keep you from sleeping at night. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Always a great privilege to hear from Dr. Kevin Leman, and we'll a little bit later be having a chance to hear from his daughter as well. Be a Great Teacher by Friday, 5 winning plays to spark world-changing potential. And Kevin, since you mentioned some things that are actually on the Tuesday section, let's just talk about that, because you have the authoritarian teacher, that's the drill sergeant. You have the permissive teacher, and unfortunately I've seen that all too often in the schools. And really the best idea is to have the authoritative teacher. And we're not just playing with words, because there's a very different way in which those teaching styles manifest themselves in the classroom.
Yes. And the interesting thing about those three is if you look at both extremes, the permissive and the authoritarian, both spur rebellion in a student's life. Now, let's transfer that over to parenthood. Hey, parents, I'm just telling you, don't be the authoritarian. And by the way, this is for all women listening to Point of View with Kerby Anderson. Now, sit down. If you're driving, hold on to the wheel. Husbands and kids hate your questions. You heard that right. We hate your questions. So if you want relationships with kids or husbands, you don't ask them questions. Dr. Leman, if I didn't ask my husband a question, I'd never hear it. No, that's not true, ma'am. Ask your husband his opinion. Kerby, can I ask you something? I'd love your opinion about what? And Kerby will talk your ear off. And same thing with Kevin. So when you're talking to kids, you have to understand this principle of teaching. They don't care what you say or what you know until they know you what? Until they know you care. So the 3 R's, we talk about in teaching are relationships, relationships, relationships. This book, titled Be a Great Teacher by Friday, could be entitled How to Be Successful in Life.
Right.
Quite frankly.
Yeah.
It really could be. So, being a great teacher, you have to have a heart for people, but you're in a difference maker position. What better to go to work and say, you know what, I can make a difference in someone's life, and literally generations of lives.
Let me, if I can, then maybe backtrack to Monday, because one of the things you talked about in there, we've mentioned this before with you, is what you call the 7 essential vitamins that your students need, because part of your book is what you need to do if you're a teacher. The other part is how you need to understand how your student perceives you. And, of course, we get into the birth order eventually. But another one is what students need. And sometimes we come into the equation, don't we, as teachers, talking about what we think they need instead of thinking about what they really need and what you need to be able to dispense to them.
Right. And, some of those, there's a lot of vitamins, but like accountability, you want to hold kids accountable. School systems across our country, this. I know you've had topics on the point of view of this. They look the other way. They're permissive. They pass kids that fail. They're afraid to hold anybody accountable. At Leman Academy, we pride ourselves on, we expect kids to succeed. We expect them to behave. I bring friends into our schools. We have 8 of them, 2 in Colorado and 6 in Arizona. And people are shocked to see these little ankle biters walking down the hallway. And sometimes they're holding hands, and sometimes they're just in a straight line. But they're not pushing and shoving and misbehaving. And when they do get out of line, we correct them. And we pull a kid aside and say, Susan, I expect more of you than what I've seen today. I'm very disappointed in that behavior. And that might mean that when that kid's picked up at school, you say to mom and dad, hey, by the way, Susan has a note to deliver to you that I've written to you, and I'd like you to talk with her about it. Well, little Susan is sweating bullets right now. But what have we done? We've told her that this is nonsense. We don't tolerate that in the classroom. We don't tolerate you pushing and shoving and hurting other people or saying words that are inappropriate. And so today, in so many parts of life, Kerby, it seems like we're just not bold enough to speak the truth.
That's right.
And the truth is, sometimes you got to get in the kid's grill in a loving way and say, this doesn't fly here. So we're not above dismissing a kid from school or, calling the home. In fact, one of the things I tell the teachers every year when I start off the school year is, hey, in the first 2 weeks of life, or first 2 weeks of the school year, send a note to the home. Better yet, call them. Initiate that contact with the parent. Give them a little view, 30 seconds, 120 seconds of how little Michael's doing in school. Believe me, when that parent hangs up that phone, they say, wow, that school's different. They seem to really care about our kids. What's more basic than that? So it's all about relationships. And those vitamins, there's many of them, from vitamin D to discipline to you name it. Vitamin E, encouragement. How about vitamin N? No is, you need both. You need encouragement, but you also need to give them vitamin N once in a while.
So again, just great material. Again, Monday, Tuesday, I thought at least get to Wednesday because you want to also get behind a student's eyes, and that's where we get into birth order, firstborn, only child, middleborn, lastborn. And I know that's something you have implemented in your schools because it is essential to recognize that they perceive the world differently. You're going to have some that are going to be more perfectionistic, others that are going to be more adaptable, some that are going to be charming and manipulative. And if you know where they are in the birth order, you'll have a lot of opportunity then to begin to see how that fleshes out. And each child is different. Each one has a different personality. Each one has maybe even a different learning style. And so, Dr. Kevin Leman, talk about how we apply some of those things that you've written about over these last many decades on such issues as birth order.
Yeah, people love birth order. Hey, all you teachers out there, would it be a great idea to put 4 babies of the family together in the back of the classroom? I can't even say it without laughing. It'd be a disaster. You need a law and order firstborn between those 2 babies. So one of the things I suggest to teachers is you make a sociogram of the classroom in terms of where they were in their family. I mean, people love birth order. Several weeks ago, I've been on Fox and Friends for years out of New York, and I pitched them with one of my leadership books, which is really a good book. And they said, well, we're going to get back to you. Well, I've heard that before. Next thing I know, I'm on the air with them. And what do they want to talk about? Birth order.
Yes.
And whether you're a teacher, a salesperson, or whatever, you have to understand that you have to get behind those students' eyes. You have to see how they see life, because some kids say, I only count life when I get attention. They're your little attention getters. And all kids are attention getters, Kerby. Are they attention getters in a negative way or a positive way? But when they get discouraged, they move to what? To power. And now their mantra in life is, I only count when I dominate, control, and win.
Yeah.
Well, ask yourself what kind of a husband or wife that's going to make someday. And then the next level, when they really get discouraged, is I feel hurt by life, and a lot of kids are hurt by life. And our prisons are full of them. And their mantra is, okay, I've been hurt by life, therefore I have a right to strike out at other people. So in a lot of ways, I'm asking the classroom teacher to be sort of a junior shrink in a way. But it's really simple. It's not rocket science. Anybody can do it. And you have to get behind their eyes and see how they see life, and then you'll develop a plan that will get into not only their head, but their heart.
And again, you have a whole section here about the types, thrill seeker, a wallflower. It's all about me, a middle of the road, anti-establishment, rebel, a missionary. It does seem to me, Kevin, that in some respects you could take this book and begin to use the material in each one of these chapters and say, okay, Bobby, well, that's where he fits here. And you could even have a chart, and Susie, she is like this. And so I know the birth order, I know their personality types, I know sort of their learning styles. And then you can craft something that would allow you to be much more effective in the lives of those students.
Yeah, it really is. I always think of this. Have you ever cried and laughed at the same time, Kerby?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting phenomenon. But when I found out that identical twins have the same DNA, they're genetically the very same person.
Right.
Okay? But God gave them different fingerprints. Why? To help the FBI? Or was this God's way of saying, you are my son, you are my daughter, you are different than everyone else? And so, it's not cookie cutter. All firstborns are not the same. Put a critical-eyed parent with a firstborn, and you won't end up with a perfectionist. You'll end up with a messy. You'll end up with an adult who will have piles all over their desk and start a lot of projects and won't finish them. So the people above us, whether it be a teacher or a parent, have a great influence on us as we're growing up.
Yes.
And I'm just thankful for that teacher, Miss Wilson, who helped turn that little punk Kevin Leman's life around in a positive direction.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll also be joined by Kristin Leman O'Reilly, and we will certainly talk a little bit more about the Leman Academy, learn a little bit more about this wonderful book, Be a Great Teacher by Friday. Of course, all sorts of information that you might want to have, including information about birth order and Kevin Leman on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
In 1972, Point of View was one of a kind, the first Christian conservative talk radio show bridging the gap between biblical values and political action. Over a half a century later, Point of View still stands unique. Consider this testimonial from David, a listener of Point of View. He said, "Point of View is the one place I can go that I can hear kindness addressing the difficult issues. You can speak the truth and still say it in the right way, and that's something I appreciate." When you support Point of View, you're equipping Americans to live out their biblical values and to speak truth boldly in the right way. Point of View needs your support right now. Will you donate generously before the end of our fiscal year, June 30th? Give today at pointofview.net or call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again with Dr. Kevin Leman, and just before we join with Kristin Leman O'Reilly, I thought, Kevin, I might just get your thoughts. You've certainly been on Point of View and even other radio programs over the years that I've interviewed you on, and as you may know, we're right in the midst of encouraging people as we come to our fiscal year end to support this ministry. What would you say to some of our listeners that are thinking about supporting Point of View?
Oh, my gosh. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I was part of listener-supported radio for 10 years. I know a lot about that. Hey, there's a lot of little hands. You know, Stephen Miller, the producer of this show, but there's a lot of other people at Point of View. You know, you hear our friend Kerby every day, and you know it's solid, it's biblical, it's relevant. That's great. But let me share something from my heart. In my home church, which I love, every Sunday we have a declaration of giving. And our pastor reminds us that we give joyfully. This is an opportunity for you to joyfully give to Point of View. Be a difference maker. Make it an encouragement to all those people behind the scenes who work hard every day to make Point of View what it is. And by the way, you know, we always talk about, well, I give to this or I give to that. No, really, you give from what? From obedience. And giving is a form of worship. And so I would just encourage you to bless these guys, whether it's a small gift, a medium gift, or some of you have been just blessed so much the Lord allows you to give a really healthy, hefty gift. Give it, but give it joyfully. It's a joy to give to an organization like Point of View. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for that opportunity, Kerby, just to say a brief word about that. God bless you.
Well, thank you. And, of course, I know all the work that you've done on different radio programs over the years, on both sides of that microphone, so that's been important. Let's just, before we get to Kristin on, talk about one of the other chapters, and that's on Thursday, dealing with relational discipline. Now, you sort of touched on that a minute ago, Kevin, but in some respects, I think it is key, as you're trying to point out, that there are principles of relational discipline. And again, if we're going to be people of authority, not authoritarian, we need to have a relationship, and we need to actually begin to use some of these principles of discipline if we're going to have successful schools. Yeah,
you know, years ago, my first job at the University of Arizona was a head resident. I was the head dorm rat. I had 360 college freshmen. And a dear friend of mine pulled me aside one day and said, Kevin, I have one piece of advice for you. I said, what's that? He said, win their cooperation. You know, I spoke to the brass at Pepsi-Cola, and one of the things a guy named Mike Lorelli shared with me, he says, hey, Kevin, you got to let your people win. You can't do everything. And so a teacher is like the conductor of the great orchestras. And yes, you have the woodwinds, and you have the brass, and you have the strings, but you know what? That conductor is that one who skillfully brings everything together so it comes out right. And that classroom teacher orchestrates a lot of things, but it gets into some of the things we've already talked about. You have to know who you're leading. If you can't lead anybody you don't know, you really can't. And so every day that teacher in the classroom is challenged with these 25 little different personalities. As we talked about, they all little walk to a little different beat of the drummer. And that's why we should stand in awe of that classroom teacher who is that wonderful difference maker every day. In the parenthood world, I talk about to parents all the time. I said, hey, let's talk about parental poker. What's that? You got 4 aces in your back pocket. Your kid can't do one thing without your signature, quite frankly. In fact, your kid wouldn't have underwear on today if you didn't buy it for him. Who's kidding who? So there's times you play those cards, you play those aces, and it gets back to what we talked about earlier, being authoritative. You're firm, and your yes is yes, and your no is no. And
right.
As a former guy that used to torment teachers, if a teacher was really weak, oh man, they were dead meat to me.
Yes.
That was easy.
You get on them. Yep.
But for some of those teachers, man, I just backed off because I knew they meant what they said.
And one of the things I love about your book is they're all the Lemanisms. Lemanism number 9, never do for a student what he can do for himself, which is kind of back to the principle you mentioned a minute ago. And back to this issue of behavior, Lemanism number 11, all behavior is purposeful and it serves a purpose. Remove the purpose and there's no longer a need for that behavior. So in some respects, what you are trying to help us understand is that a lot of it is common sense, but it's the common sense maybe we've developed over a lifetime. And it's amazing. I'm sure, Kevin, this has happened to you as well. You'll share some insight that you think is pretty straightforward and pretty obvious, and you'll share it with a 20-something teacher just out of educational classes, and they just go, wow, that's really brilliant. And you're going, well, if you hang around long enough, you'll pick up some of those things. But if you don't want to wait for all those decades, I think you should pick up the book, because you've just got this book peppered with these Lemanisms, don't you?
Yeah, when a kid throws, that word purposive, by the way, is a psychological term. It's a word that you and I probably haven't used this year. Well, I probably use it because I use it a lot, but most people don't use the word purposive. But when a kid throws a temper tantrum, what's the purpose of the behavior? He's telling you that I am an authority over you. And that can be in the classroom, it can be in the home, whatever. And you need to know how to defang that. Just to be funny, if a kid throws a temper tantrum in the mall, I've told parents for years, step over the 4-year-old. There's a great temptation to step on that little guy. Don't do that. That's illegal. Don't do that. You get in trouble. But when you walk over him and step away, you've removed your sails from the child's wind. And
That's
so, there's a skill here as a teacher in managing these little personalities. And like I say, the book could be entitled How to Be Successful in Life. It's that general of a book, but specifically, Chrissy and I both have a heart for teachers, and we think this certainly beats an apple or a gift card.
I think so. Be a great teacher by Friday. Of course, we talked about be a great leader by Friday, but we now bring to the microphone Kristin Leman O'Reilly, an individual with a BA in elementary education, BA in psychology, and an MA in teaching, and is responsible and is the director of curriculum and instruction at the Leman Academy of Excellence. So, Kristin, welcome to Point of View.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Dr. Leman and I have known each other for a few years, and I can't say that I've written quite as many books as he has, but I've written quite a number, and I've always got a kick out of how my daughters react when they sometimes read my books. And given the fact that this is in your area of teaching, I'd love to get your initial thoughts about how this book you are using and how it's been effective and what your reaction has been, because I'm sure you give it to most of the teachers there in the Leman Academy.
Absolutely. You know what? It's been positively received. And, especially when you think about that new teacher that's stepping into a classroom, whether they're coming straight out of college or maybe it's even a second career for them. If you watch the news for any amount of time, you know that unfortunately we're losing teachers. And so Dr. Leman and I wrote this book to equip teachers to be difference makers. And, the tools that we supply in Be a Great Teacher by Friday is meant to encourage teachers, whether they're in the classroom now or they're thinking about teaching, or maybe you're a homeschool mom even, and you just need some different strategies. We're really hoping that this book will help to be that difference maker, because let's face it, they are raising up the next generation, and our teachers need that support. And so overall, it's been incredibly positive, and it's just very practical. So that's the thing that I think teachers want to know. What do I do? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. So we try to just break it down as easy as possible. And of course, it's written in that same wonderful Dr. Leman style, and I've added my own little twist as well, so that it's very practical and tangible for teachers.
Well, let's, if we can, play on your background in terms of teaching and psychology, because we were talking about behavior, and one of those very important principles in terms of relational discipline is cultivate your classroom culture. Now, obviously, you're mostly responsible for the curriculum, but you also want to actually have the teachers develop the right type of classroom. And we've all been in classrooms. As a matter of fact, you talk about this in the book. book that are about as sterile as a doctor's waiting room. And then we have some that are certainly nurturing, but also the issue of discipline in the midst of that. I'd love to have you speak to that issue for just a minute, what you are teaching your teachers in terms of how to handle discipline and how to really cultivate the right kind of classroom.
Yeah, and let's face it, on average, students spend about 180 days at school a year. And so to me, that's a pretty significant amount of time. So when we talk about cultivating that classroom, I want work, if you will, to be a place where I look forward to going. I don't want to say, oh my gosh, I have to go to work today and it's misery for me or for my kids. So the time that you invest, especially before a school year starts, is incredibly important because everything we do is based in relationships.
Let me take a break, and when we get back and finish off that conversation, we'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Kevin Leman and Kristin Leman O'Reilly. The book is entitled Be a Great Teacher by Friday. First of all, you obviously can find it in your local bookstore, but we do have a link on our website so that you could get it in hardback or Kindle. And Kevin, for just a minute, one of the other things you talk about in Friday, since I wanted to at least cover all 5 days, to be a role model in terms of being an advocate and an ambassador. We certainly have have a whole culture now saying, well, I'm not a role model. Well, yes, you are. If you're a parent, if you're an athlete, if you're a celebrity, you're a role model. You may not be a good role model, but it does seem to me that one of the most important role models for a young person, because they spend so much time in school, is the teacher. And so parents should be role models, teachers should be as well. And I believe you probably inculcate those ideas in the teachers that you have in the Leman Academy, don't you?
Right. And everybody just stop for a moment. Think about who were those people who loved you just the way you were? And what were the attributes that they have? I got news for you. They were approachable. They were forthright. They were honest with you. And you're right. You know, we all are models. And so you don't hang out with people that you don't like. You don't hang out with people that are unapproachable. And so for those people, and again, I've asked this question probably thousands of times, would probably be pretty close to the right answer or number. The average person says, well, there was probably 1, 2, maybe 3 people in my life who were that way. Most of us don't have 20 people. We have a short list. I always say, if you see a turtle on a fence post, you know he didn't get there by himself.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, you are a model. And as I tell parents, the kids are always taking emotional notes, spiritual notes, psychological notes on how you treat each other. And those classroom kids, I'll tell you, they're taking notes on you, teacher, every day. You are a difference maker or you're in the way. So Chrissy can speak to that as well. She's a marvelous teacher. I've watched her firsthand as she gives our lectures to I shouldn't say lectures because they're not lectures. They're really fun to be a part of, to our teachers. She's a wonderful teacher. God bless her.
Yeah, Chris, let me talk about that, because one of the things I love about this book, and of course I love about your dad, is the practicality. I mean, we've already mentioned the Lemanisms, of which there are many. Mm-hmm. There's the blow-up quotes. There's an apple a day. And as somebody who has, of course, been through the educational program and then now teaching it, you know there's a lot of educational theory, and certainly some of that is found within this book. But there's just an enormous amount of practical material in this book. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. You know, and just thinking back to what we were talking about before, you know, think about where that desk sits in a teacher's classroom. Think about how whether they're desks or tables, how are those set up? And what is that communicating back to kids and to families? You know, if the teacher's desk is front and center, that gives a very clear message that I'm in charge. And if kids are seated in straight rows, that gives a really clear indication of how that teacher views the learner. Whereas if you walk into a classroom and you can't even find the teacher's desk, maybe it's tucked back in the back corner and students are learning together in small pods, their desks are pushed together in little clusters, that gives a whole different sense of what this classroom looks like and the view that teacher has of how kids learn best. And so we've tried to drop little practical tips like that of just even rethinking how you set up your classroom so that it builds a sense of community and belonging, because without that, I'm sorry, the greatest teacher in the world would still struggle, because it's all based in having those positive relationships with kids.
Let's, if we can, for just a minute, mention that right beneath your picture, of course, we have a picture of this book, Be a Great Teacher, but we also have the link to the LemanAcademy.com. And first of all, we do have listeners in both Colorado and Arizona. That's the first thing I might mention, if they would want to go there. But even for listeners all over the country, there may be a way that they could communicate with you, because you've already mentioned a few things that you do in your academy. Maybe they could learn from you, learn vicariously something that's worked in your academy that they could apply in their Christian school or their charter school. So talk about, when people land on that website, some of the resources that would be available to everyone, but especially for individuals that might want to enroll their child or grandchild in the Leman Academy.
Yeah, so when you go to the website right away, we have right now a pop-up that will allow you, if you're in Arizona or in Colorado, to go ahead and register for the next school year. But there are resources on the website if you want to learn more about who we are and what we do, and the why behind why we do the things that we do that really try to set us apart. So When my husband Dennis and I wrote the charter for Leman Academy, we were very clear on not wanting it just to be another school. We wanted to be distinctly different from the school down the street. And so those distinctives are there, whether it's our virtues and values that we teach or our core values, or even our view of the teacher and the learner. There's some good reading that you can have on the website as well. So I hope that'll be a blessing to your listeners.
Kevin, I might just mention.
Let me add something there. People can go to the birthorderguy.com, and
that was my next point.
That's our website. But we have a podcast. It's got about 1.5 billion hits. It's called Have a New Kid by Friday. But we talk about marriage and education issues. So people can get that on Spotify or any place where you get it. Just remember, Have a New Kid by Friday, and it's fun to listen to. People like it. It's very practical.
Let me just mention, I do have a link there under your picture of birthorderguy.com. Also in the back of the book, you have everything from your address, your phone number. So if people wanted to have you come and speak, which they can, we also have a link to your X as well as Facebook and some of the material about the podcast, because I wanted people to be able to contact you. So you can go to the birthorderguy.com, which is right under Kevin's picture. And then, of course, you can find out a little bit more about the LemanAcademy.com, and that's under Kristin's picture. And Kevin, just finish us off here because you wrote the book and also the one on leadership. But as you said, whether you're going to be a teacher or not, these are basic common sense principles, biblical principles that if you apply them to your life, if you apply them to your marriage and family, are going to certainly help you to be successful, aren't they?
Yeah, I think you'll love the book. If you don't, save it for the fall and the winter, and they tell me they make great kindling, so I won't be offended. Use the book the best you can.
Yep. Well, we've actually done broadcasts for literally decades. Probably before Kristin was born, but certainly after she was. So it is always a delight to have you on the program. I've appreciated each one of your books that we've done interviews on, but the last two, of course, have been being a great leader, and this one being a great teacher. Be a great teacher by Friday. If you want any of that information, we have links to both of these individuals, and if you want to follow up off air and learn a little bit more, that is certainly the case. So Kevin and Kristin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. You're the best.
I'm going to take a break. When we come back, you know what? We had what Trump called a 12-day war, and we even supposedly have a if you will, ceasefire. We're going to see it on again, off again. I'll get into some of the details about that. Turns out that ICE has arrested 11 Iranian nationals who were here illegally. So those may be individuals that might have wanted to retaliate, but we're going to send them packing, and we'll talk more about that as well. There is a lot going on, but as we go to a break, don't forget, as we mentioned just a minute ago, we're encouraging you to give to Point of View. We have that banner that says Anchored to Truth. This would be a great time as we go to a break to either click on that button or to give us a call. 800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. If you've enjoyed the interview, we'd love to hear from you. We'll be right back.
Well, I do need to say that we are running out of time to raise funds by June 30th, the deadline that will determine our budget for the next fiscal year. Your gift will make a difference. And thanks to an ongoing matching challenge, your gift will be doubled through the month of June. Here's why Point of View is the media ministry to support as we forge into the future. Point of View is trustworthy, with proven dedication to a biblical worldview for 53 years and counting. Additionally, Point of View is making a multi-generational impact. Your support equips listeners to articulate biblical truth about the issues of our day with their children and even their grandchildren. Americans need a proven resource to equip current and future generations to live out God's truth in our time. Give it to them today by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Well, once again, we have an opportunity to talk about a number of things that are taking place across the oceans, and we will come back to some other things happening here domestically. Even when we talk about Iran, as I mentioned just a minute ago, ICE yesterday was able to arrest 11 Iranian nationals here in the United States. They were here not only illegally, but they had criminal records. Now, whether they were part of what is oftentimes called a sleeper cell, although I've heard a lot of people say, I hate that term. It's, either you're a terrorist or you're not, and forget the idea of a sleeper cell. Nevertheless, they are rounding some of them up, and we wanted to take the worst first. And these individuals from a dangerous country, Iran, who have criminal record, that's reason enough to remove them from any possibility of engaging in either criminal or terroristic activities. So if you haven't heard that, just thought I'd announce that as we get into this issue. My first article comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. Aren't always friends of Donald Trump. Sometimes we'll give him credit. Oftentimes we'll give him a great deal of criticism. But they reminded us of how silly some of this is right now, because we heard that there was a ceasefire, and then you had, of course, the fact that there's now evidence that it was broken. But let's go back to yesterday when I mentioned that there had been some missiles that had been fired at Qatar or Qatar, depending on which translation you want to use, and those, interestingly enough, were actually given some advance notice, and that is that there was a reason to actually announce ahead of time that it was coming. And so as a result, Iran told its people, since they don't sometimes have access to outside news information other than maybe through the internet, that they fired 14 ballistic missiles at U.S. troops and destroyed the American air base. Nothing of the sort was actually done at all, which was in supposedly retaliation in the U.S. strikes on 3 nuclear sites. But I love the editor saying, here on planet Earth, the base was already substantially evacuated. The missiles were intercepted with no casualties reported. All sides said Iran gave advance notice that the attacks were coming. And this is a good example of what they call Persian kabuki theater. And it would be laughable if real missiles weren't aimed at Americans. And they pointed out it's no small matter, by the way, that they fired on Qatar, because that is one of the countries probably friendliest to Iran in that region, or that they fired these missiles at the U.S. Central Command regional headquarters. But nevertheless, it was mocked by President Trump as a very weak response, and Iran had gotten it out of their system. So nevertheless, that was what we talked about briefly yesterday. It was much ado about nothing, as we've said before. Now, what the editors began to do, and we're going to see a little bit more of this with some of the other articles I bring to you today, is that all the predictions, they say that a strike on Iran would almost certainly result in thousands of American deaths, they put in parentheses Tucker Carlson, or set off World War III, and boy, I can find a lot of people that were saying that, strongly signaled it doesn't want the fight. And I think you might be able to see that even though there was, during the so-called ceasefire, some missiles fired from Iran, Those could have been fired in error or by hardliners who were not willing to give in, but generally there seems to be an uneasy and difficult to maybe maintain for a long period of time a ceasefire. We want more than a ceasefire, and even a ceasefire is, again, trust but verify and assume that you're going to have the Iranians lie, but nevertheless, that was the case. But one of the things I thought I might report, which is in this article as well, is that Israel continued their bombing, but they were actually bombing very strategic areas. One that they bombed was the Evin prison. That is a prison where oftentimes dissidents, these would be people that the Iranian mullahs see as dangerous or somehow controversial, that's where many of those Iranian dissidents are held or tortured. And Israel went in and blew the gate off of the prison. More symbolic, but who knows? It might have allowed for some of those individuals to escape. Israel also struck the Iranian Revolutionary Guard units because they are focused on internal security, and they also hit the headquarters of the Baji paramilitary, which oftentimes are individuals used to put down some of the protests. Arab Spring was a good example, and some of the others. And these, in a sense, were deliberate attacks by Israel on the regime's institutions of repression. So I thought it might be helpful to mention that. Now, there has been quite a debate as to whether or not there's going to be regime change, and I think President Trump has made it very clear that's not the case. But on his Truth Social, he did, with tongue in cheek, say, I know it's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, M-I-G-A, so now we've got Mega and Mecha, and now we've got Miga, why wouldn't there be a regime change? And at that point, the editor said, maybe Tulsi Gabbard fainted. But nevertheless, they said, we really don't read President Trump as proposed in another Iraq war. He says he wants peace and harmony. And sure enough, he announced later, as we saw after the program ended yesterday, that there was a call for a complete and total ceasefire within 24 hours and an end to what he has referred to as the 12-day war. I don't know that that will stick because I don't think the war quite is over, but I do believe that we are safer than we've ever been before. They go on to say that Iran appears to have lost its nuclear enrichment and weaponization facilities, its leading military commanders and nuclear scientists, and much of its missile production and launch capacity. Israel may have liked more time to hit more targets, but it all has to worry about protecting its cities. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear that Israel won't return to a status quo in which Iran or its proxies, the militants, endanger its existence. And so the question is, what next? Authoritarians appear to be sturdy at the moment. Militarily, they're humiliated. Ayatollah Khamenei would maybe fall prey to a popular uprising. So who knows whether something like that might take place organically there in Iran. But as for Donald Trump, a ceasefire and a 12-day war is his way of assuring some of the isolationists in the MAGA movement that this won't be another Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, each day we'll learn a little bit more, but when we come back, I'll get to another article by Jeffrey Blehar, who oftentimes is quite critical of the president, but in this case, I had to say that this, as he points out, is exactly why elections matter. And so we'll get into that in just a minute. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to see some of these facts and figures, I'd like to read some of these articles, they are available on our website at pointofview.net. The ones yesterday from National Review and from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, these from a number of different similar sources, are available on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Years ago, a doctor wrote an article entitled, "What's Keeping David McCullough from Sleeping?" This noted historian and award-winning author had trouble sleeping because he was worrying about what was happening in the country. He was concerned that our leaders have forgotten about history, they're unaware of the past, and uninterested in how they would be remembered in the future. Timothy Gegline, who was a special assistant to President Bush, opened his article with a story to remind us how ignorant students and adults are about history. One study from years ago by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute surveyed more than 2,500 Americans. They found that only half of those adults could name the three branches of government, and only 36% of college graduates could do so. 18% of students tested could not name a single right or freedom guaranteed under the First Amendment. Turns out that the highest performing school on this civics test was Harvard University, but even this prestigious school did not do that well. Harvard scored 69%. You know, most teachers would consider that to be a D+. In other words, it would be a failing grade. A more recent study by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni found that half of all college graduates did not know how long the terms of their representatives and senators were, and 43% did not know the First Amendment gave them freedom of speech. A full third could not identify any rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. So I would suggest that you remember that all those students surveyed are now of voting age, and some may be running for public office. Yes, that can keep you from sleeping at night. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, our second article is entitled "Trump's Iran Strike Shows Precisely Why Elections Matter." And I thought for just a minute we might put some of this in context. I might also borrow a little bit from a very good piece by Jim Dennison, reminding us where we were 2 weeks ago and then reminding us where we were 2 years ago. Sometimes you fail to, in a sense, understand some of the remarkable changes that are taking place right before our very eyes. And Jeffrey Blahar, who writes this, actually puts together an edition. This is what he calls his 42nd edition of the Carnival of Fools. Most of the time he's criticizing Donald Trump, President Trump, and his administration for foolish things they're saying and doing, and usually it has to do with domestic issues, although to be fair, he at the very end does take a shot at Donald Trump for still not dealing with the very important issue of TikTok. We'll get to that in just a minute. But for his maybe constant attempt at finding some of the foolish things that are said or done by people in the administration, both in the Republican administration, but also in Congress, Democrats. He, in this case, has a much different tone. Because, first of all, he starts out by saying, look, I had to laugh and take a deep breath with on last Thursday. You had the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, announced that Donald Trump would decide within 2 weeks whether to offer American military assistance to Israel in knocking out Iran's most difficult-to-reach nuclear facilities. He said, I had a nervous laugh, mind you. I was quietly gulping air because at the moment I was suspecting the planes were already flying. And then he reminds us that everybody from the New York Times to a lot of pretty significant individuals that we've quoted over the years who were all joining in their political commentary saying, well, this may be a good illustration that Donald Trump is on the verge of backing down, or maybe he has been persuaded by some of the isolationists or the restrainers in his administration to tap the brakes on Benjamin Netanyahu. Well, you didn't fool Jeffrey Blahar. He knew what was coming. Whenever he gave you the head fake of 2 weeks, he knew it would probably be about 2 days, and that's exactly what it was. So anyway, he goes on. He never made any sense to me. The inexorable logic of the military situation dictated a strike. And sooner rather than later, after a week's worth of pounding from the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, the Iranian regime was disoriented and defenseless, helplessly exposed to Israeli and American air superiority. And that is still the case, I might add as well. So he said, so we finished the job. It was the right thing to do. In fact, now this is pretty amazing. He says this, I will go further than that. If Donald Trump's finest moment as a politician is forever destined to be that dark day when he arose bleeding from an assassin's bullet to throw a reassuringly defiant fist to the terrified crowd, then there's good reason to think that Saturday will ultimately rank second. So he sees that as pretty significant. And he again recognizes what is unfolding right before our very eyes. He gives you the justification. He said, look, I operate by rather simple logic myself. The Iranian regime, whose unofficial motto is death to America, and which openly calls for the destruction of Israel, our sole true ally in the region, seeks a nuclear weapon to achieve this goal. So again, if the price we pay is merely a few bombs from a B-2, then the question is pretty easily answered. Iran's nuclear program has either been destroyed permanently or set back decades. The mullahs are very upset, as one imagines murderous religious fanatics tend to be, and it also seemingly shows that they are powerless to do much more than cause a temporary economic reaction by maybe, and again, I'm going to put maybe, he doesn't put that, but I put maybe, laying mines across the Strait of Hormuz. Because right now, the Straits of Hormuz, even if you were to blockade that, which I don't think they're going to do, but even if they did, it turns out that it would hurt Iran and probably China and a few other countries more than it would hurt the United States. But I'll digress, and if that comes up, I'll explain why, but that's the case. So he goes on to say this unalloyed victory for the forces of sanity and civilization. He says to those who point to the inevitability of an unforeseen blowback, I will remind you that Iran and its proxies have been engaging in low-level conflict with America for well over a decade now. I think in the speech by President Trump, he said 30 years, and one of the commentaries I read yesterday said 40 years. Just go back to think about some of the things that have taken place there, as we have well documented. He says then, here's the key point to his title, none of this would have happened if Kamala Harris were president. I think that's pretty clear. Instead, President Harris would be sitting atop a Democratic coalition, which would certainly not approve of this in any significant way. And so he says, would this be something that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, David Hogg, a variety of other names he mentions there, would they even go along with this? And he says to ask the question out loud is to answer it. No. For that reason alone, it is no exaggeration to say that the shape of the world perceptibly turned for the better on the outcome of last November's election. You can draw a straight line, he says, between Donald Trump's winning the 2024 race and Iran's nuclear weapons program now being best described as a series of different-sized craters. Pretty strong line there. He says, as a writer primarily concerned with domestic matters, the sorts of actors who keep the carnival of fools freshly stocked on a weekly basis, I'm disinclined to break character for a sober foreign policy decision. He then recommends some people, including Noah Rothman, who we quote quite often. But he says, I'm proud to be an American today and happy to give credit to Donald Trump for genuinely living up to his self-billing as the indispensable man in this case. Well, just so that he didn't look like he was such a fawning toady, he did go on to say there is one issue that we've got to take concerns with, and that is Donald Trump has once again announced with little public fanfare or media commentary that he once again was not executing the terms of the TikTok bill, which was passed into law and signed by President Biden. Again, remember that this was something that was signed in the previous administration, and it was one that was supported by Republicans and Democrats, and Donald Trump instead decided to invent a 90-day extension and then return the issue in September. But here we keep postponing what is actually something that was passed by Congress and should be implemented. So he does take at least one shot at the end. And again, if you want to try to put some of this in perspective, of course, we had a ceasefire, and then you had a situation in which Iran fired some more missiles, so Israel went back, and Donald Trump used a naughty word, which he rarely does in front of the cameras today because he was so frustrated with what's going on in the Middle East. So we'll see whether we have an on-again or off-again particular ceasefire. But our good friend Jim Dennison reminded us of just even 2 weeks ago that before Israel launched its surprise attack on June 13th, targeting some of these key Iranian military and nuclear facilities, many doubted that the Jewish state would even try such a venture, and here we are now. And to recognize that both the U.S. and Israel risk possible repercussions. You know, the Strait of Hormuz we mentioned a minute ago, launching missiles, asymmetric attacks, sleeper cells, and cyber attacks. But that's 2 weeks ago. If we want to go back 2 years ago, in the run-up to October 7th, 2023, the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, predicted the destruction of Israel at the hands of Hamas, that this would be the fulfillment of Quran chapter 17, in which the enemies under Islam will be utterly destroyed and fall into their hands. That didn't work out. And if you want to also look at Hezbollah, you have Hassan Nasrallah, who basically said Israel may have nuclear weapons, but it is actually a country that is weaker than a spider's web. And Israel may appear strong from the outside, but it will be easily destroyed and defeated. Well, it just didn't quite turn out that way, did it? And so, if nothing else, we are seeing a remarkable change in the Middle East. And though there'll be their naysayers, I think we see some remarkable changes that we should applaud. And so as we come to our break, let me mention again that if you appreciate some of the kinds of things we talk about here on Point of View, including posting some of these articles from Wall Street Journal, National Review, New York Times, Washington Post, and others, I would encourage you to go to our website. There's a banner there that says Anchored to Truth. We now have a $60,000 match challenge. So whatever you give, one-time gift or a monthly gift, it will be matched dollar for dollar. If you'd like to give us a call, that number is 800-347-5151. Of course, the website is pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
1972. Point of View was one of a kind, the first Christian conservative talk radio show bridging the gap between biblical values and political action. Over a half a century later, Point of View still stands unique. Consider this testimonial from David, a listener of Point of View. He said, "Point of View is the one place I can go that I can hear kindness addressing the difficult issues. You can speak the truth and still say it in the right way, and that's something I appreciate." When you support Point of View, you're equipping Americans to live out their biblical values and to speak truth boldly in the right way. Point of View needs your support right now. Will you donate generously before the end of our fiscal year, June 30th? Give today at pointofview.net or call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about some things domestically. We've spent enough time certainly talking about what's happening overseas. We'll continue to do that. But this last half hour, I wanted to do two things. First of all, to look at what is happening right now to the left and even the Democratic Party. We've got one article by Victor Davis Hanson, another one by Byron York, which remind us that as, again, some of these successes are coming in the direction of Donald Trump, or maybe some future successes in terms of a Republican House and Senate, although we still will continue to watch for that, the status of the big, beautiful bill, as they call it. That will be something we'll work on in this segment. And then I just thought before the end of the program today, I would certainly, as maybe a celebration, remind us of the fact that today is, if you will, the third anniversary of the decision that came down on the issue of abortion, the Dobbs decision, June 24th, 2022, and now, of course, this is June 24th, 2025. And I may make some brief comments about that in the last segment, and then we'll come back to it maybe Thursday in our second segment, because Liberty McCarter will be with us, and I want to get her thoughts about the issue of pro-life and a number of other issues as well. So let's get into it. Victor Davis Hanson just asked the question, can the left ever stop its craziness? He uses a couple of Democratic leaders to use the illustration. Number one, he talks about Alex Padilla, and of course we've talked about that before, a senator from the state of California, crashed the press conference with Homeland Security Secretary Kristin Leman, barged forward to the podium shouting about deportation, got his media moment because the Secret Service agents, who apparently had no idea who he was, forcibly removed him. Number two, he mentions Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, who actually attempted a, if you will, he calls it a pseudo filibuster, speaking nonstop for 25 hours straight, not to delay legislation, but just to fixate on President Donald Trump. And then number three, a Democratic state representative, Julie Van Hoffen, I think is how you pronounce the name, is posted on social media, something I was unaware of, a bloody guillotine, which then bore the title, "In these difficult times, some cuts may be necessary," and juxtapose that with an image of a hanging, beheaded Donald Trump, who, by the way, was the target of two failed assassination attempts. Didn't know about that one. Think that maybe some people in the press should really criticize that more so. But you also then begin to say, whose side are you on? And he gives us 5 very good illustrations. You know, are we on the side of illegal aliens who spit on the American flag, who burn the American flag while waving Mexican flags? Or number two, do we really want to take on Kilmore Obligado Garcia, who we now know was not only an illegal alien, but also was an accused domestic abuser, a gang leader, probably also a human trafficker? They also, number three, he talks about Mahmoud Kahili, who is the pro-Hamas student who helped organize and even defend some of the anti-Semitic demonstrations in Colombia. Then just take it out of the protest, just even some of the left have actually lionized the individual Luigi Mangione, who was the individual that killed the CEO of the United Healthcare CEO. And then others talk about this illegal alien, Mohammad Sabri Soliman. And so he just goes through all sorts of examples of, are these the people you really want to put front and center to illustrate what you are believing in, what you're backing, and all the rest? And then ask, I think, a very important question. If you at least can find some areas of agreement, couldn't there be some places where Democratic leaders would at least cooperate with Donald Trump, with other Republicans? They say, for example, couldn't they at least partner with Donald Trump to allow green cards to illegal aliens who have no criminal records, who have not been on public assistance, who are now employed and are residing in the United States and have been there for at least 5 years? Another example, he says, is couldn't Democrats meet with the president to express bipartisan support for Israel and for this war with Iran? And the answer seems to be, well, not yet anyway. And so finally, he just asked the, I think, fundamental question, why is this happening? And that, of course, gets us into the piece we'll talk about with Byron York, because he says, part of it is Democratic leaders are exasperated because they don't really control any of the levels of political power. Congress, the White House, the Supreme Court. They're frustrated because they need to maybe appease some of the more radical parts of their party. And also they may be frustrated because it seems like everything they've tried against Donald Trump this time, last time it was Russia, but this time smear him with a label of being a fascist or a dictator. And he actually, in the latest YouGov survey, showed him gaining public support on securing the border and deportation. Label him as a racist, and then you find the latest Rasmussen tracking polls, Trump garnering 54% approval from African Americans, 53% from Hispanic Americans. And as he ends his article, says, the counter-revolution under Donald Trump seems to continue. The people cheer, and the Democrats seem to be what? Barking at the moon. Which brings me to the other piece by Byron York, because he also is trying to remind us where we were not so long ago. He starts his piece by saying that 8 years ago, in the first year of Donald Trump's first term as president, you already had the Russian special counsel, the special counsel on Russia, that would be Robert Mueller, who had already been appointed and was investigating Trump and already done so by this time for a month. And he said on the other side, you had the Democratic strategy of attack, and you had the major news organizations, cable news producers and others that would speculate about a Trump-Russia connection every hour of every day. And he says by the third paragraph, the reason I bring this up is to contrast the situation with what we have today. Democrats seem distracted and back on their feet. The party's engaged in some bitter infighting. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And they haven't really come up with a coherent and unified strategy at this point. And he says part of that goes back to Democrats being in a state of shock, even going back to last summer when an internal coup resulted in President Biden's departure from the re-election campaign. But they really don't have a big unifying cause right now. And we've seen, if nothing else, the actions, which gets back to the piece, interestingly enough, which overlaps very much with Victor Davis Hanson, of a number of Democrats, especially leaders, who have decided to use what he calls a 1960s-style civil disobedience particular strategy, in which they want to get themselves detained, arrested, handcuffed, and in one way or another bring attention to what is taking place. Byron York says it's kind of funny, but not really. It's an indication of the Democratic Party's impotence on part of Trump's presidency, and then points out some of the problems that Democrats are facing right now. And I did not know this until I read this article. First, the Democratic National Committee has fallen behind substantially in the money race. If you look at what has been raised in terms of the DNC, about $18 million cash on hand. What about the RNC, the Republican National Committee? Well, that's almost $68 million. So there is a striking difference here in that regard. Somebody close to the Democratic National Committee told the New York Post, we're 6 months in and we are drowning. We have no clear path or plan. The midterms are going to come before we know it, and then we're really going to, and he uses some words we don't use on the air. And then this is where Byron York reminds us of some of the infighting between the DNC chairman, Ken Martin, and at the time, the vice president of the DNC, David Hogue. And that has been, I think, another one of those issues. So they don't have the money, but they also don't have the issues, because he also says that Democrats still are on the wrong side of a lot of issues like immigration, wokeism, national security, and the rest. And if it's not bad enough I haven't really said a thing about the New York governor's race, but it's worth mentioning that right now it looks real possible that in the Democratic primary for the New York mayor's race, you will have a Democratic socialist that might indeed win. Zohran Mamdani, who is actually affiliated with the Democratic Socialist of America. And this is certainly not going to be helpful, if you will, for the national brand of the Democratic Party. Maybe in the future, maybe we'll do this on Friday, talk about all the things that he has proposed. And I would imagine some of those are so extreme that even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is saying, can we tap the brakes on some of this? But we'll see where that goes. Let's take a break. Come back and talk about abortion right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let's, if we can, remind ourselves that 3 years ago today is when the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Dobbs versus Women's Health Organization, and that was a case which overturned Roe versus Wade. And the editors of National Review wanted to make sure that we considered that. I'll send, maybe we'll spend some time talking about that again on Thursday when Liberty McCarter's in studio, but nevertheless, the editors put it this way. Pro-lifers have been so understandably preoccupied with the new challenges and difficulties of the post-Roe America that they have insufficiently celebrated the fact that we're now living in America, that this America that we live in today does not start out with the assumption that abortion is routine. For nearly 50 years, they said, the Supreme Court has pretended that the Constitution protects abortion from democratic regulation, notwithstanding the lack of support for the proposition in the text, the logic, and even the structure or the original understanding. The justices who renounced that lie in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Center exposed themselves, as they remind us, to scurrilous criticisms and even threats to their safety. They merit praise for striking a blow for constitutional fidelity and for human rights rightly considered. I might also add, as we did just a minute ago, this is another great illustration of elections have consequences. The justices that made that possible for that decision to come down were individuals who were either appointed by one of them, George Herbert Walker Bush, another one, George W. Bush, or then Donald Trump. And that, I think, is a reminder of how elections do have consequences. They go on to then point out a few issues. The great danger at that moment was of a political backlash, and they even point out abetted by furious media and other kinds of politicians who were arguing that this will now lead to a national abortion law and reestablish a Roe in that regard. They go on to remind us that didn't happen. In the first elections after Dobbs, Republicans regained control of the House. Every pro-life incumbent won in the Senate and governor's races, while the latter group included people who signed on to a law major protections for the unborn. In the red and even some purple states, politicians can enact such protections and thrive. And I might point out that right after the decision came down, we did have some special elections, and on many of those special elections where the only issue on the ballot was abortion and where there was an incredible amount of money brought in, it looked like there would be a real backlash and this would ultimately not prevail. But as we now have the hindsight of 3 years, we can see that that did not take place. Now, they did point out that some of the political setbacks that pro-lifers did experience, tragic though they were, are also in need to be put in context of the effective legalization of abortion at any state of pregnancy. So the bottom line is, in some of these states, they've actually gone even beyond Roe versus Wade. And the point that the editors are making is there's nowhere to go but up. The states that have legislated in favor of abortion since Dobbs largely stuck with the status quo or defeated entirely disorganized opposition. Nearly 24 other states have restricted abortion to some degree, and even in the states that afford no legal rights to the unborn, it remains possible to persuade voters to change their minds, with no federal mandate for abortion shutting down the debate before it begins. So again, some great points that they were making here. Couple of other recommendations. First of all, they say in every state, pro-lifers should be pushing for the most life-protecting regime of law that can be politically sustained. And that must include dispelling the dangerous and legal misinformation that supporters of abortion have been promoting. No pro-life laws anywhere in this country require doctors to wait for pregnant women undergoing a medical crisis. And again, I think there has been a real need for good messaging in that regard. They go on to say that both states and the federal government, as appropriate, should also join churches and private charities in supporting mothers, children, and their families in meeting economic needs. This can and should take form in a number of different ways, from making catastrophic health insurance available on the market to giving parents tax relief, and just a number of other things they mention as well. They finally mentioned that, of course, with Roe versus Wade gone, the federal government continues to undermine states' ability to stop the violence of abortion. It entirely refuses to enforce the ban already in law by shipping abortion pills interstate and even to states where using them for abortions is illegal. And so that, I think, is another battleground, and we'll talk about that more maybe on Thursday with Liberty, who has written 2 of our booklets on the issue of the abortion pill. Finally, let me just mention that they also say pressing forward with this agenda will require some adjustments in the relationship between pro-life activists and politicians. For politicians, many of them would prefer to be done with this issue and are complaining that sometimes activists make unrealistic demands, but nevertheless, this is a problem that can be solved in a noble cause that unites us and requires no less. So, nevertheless, editors of the Wall Street Journal talking about 3 years after the Dobbs decision, and we find ourselves there today. As we wind down, let's, if we can, encourage you to pray. As you go to the website, pointofview.net, you're going to find many of these articles we've mentioned, including, of course, information about the book by Kevin Leman and Kristin Leman O'Reilly, Be a Great Teacher by Friday. You'll also see that we have our Pray for America, and I think this is a really appropriate time to mention that if you haven't signed up to receive that, we've been really encouraging you to pray about what is happening in Israel and Iran, and recognize that even while we're talking about Israel and we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and there is a spiritual battle that is taking place, and we see in Ephesians 6, verse 12, that we are and should be fighting a spiritual battle because the spiritual forces of evil are in the heavenly places. We're also to stand firm, and we are to pray at all times in the Spirit. You know, Michael Yosef's been on the program, and he said, in these uncertain days, Christians around the world must unite in prayer. We easily forget that there are many Christian believers in Iran right now suffering intense persecution. The war has also caused many Muslims in Iran and many Jews in Israel to become receptive to the Christian gospel. So pray that in this time of war, God will open many hearts to Jesus, the Prince of Peace. So we certainly encourage you to sign up for our Pray for America, and it is on the right-hand side there along with our Point of View highlights on Spotify. And, of course, there is the banner that we have there, Anchored to Truth. And even though we're going off the air, if you would want to join with us today and support this ministry, let me encourage you to do so. We are, as we mentioned just a minute ago, to a point where we have now a $60,000 match challenge, which means your gift today will be matched dollar for dollar. And I would encourage you to consider maybe at least a one-time gift, but I hope some of you might even join with us in the Truth Team. $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year would be doubled, and that would be a great encouragement to us. Most importantly, let me thank again Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Visit the website, pointofview.net, or give us a call, 800-347-5151.
Well, I do need to say that we are running out of time to raise funds by June 30th, the deadline that will determine our budget for the next fiscal year. Your gift will make a difference. And thanks to an ongoing matching challenge, your gift will be doubled through the month of June. Here's why Point of View is the media ministry to support as we forge into the future. Point of View is trustworthy, with proven dedication to a biblical worldview for 53 years and counting. Additionally, Point of View is making a multi-generational impact. Your support equips listeners to articulate biblical truth about the issues of our day with their children and even their grandchildren. Americans need a proven resource to equip current and future generations to live out God's truth in our time. Give it to them today by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.